Also, I just, I'm really not all that accomplished. I'm just old. But I did want to take this opportunity because I've been a big fan of ASMFC for a long time, and sitting in the back watching Jeopardy, I realized how little I know about those details, and I'm very impressed and happy that the expertise is around us. Today I can really only cover the tip of a giant iceberg. I want to talk a little bit about the Gulf of Maine, because we're in Maine now, and give you a little bit of what I think of as the big picture, what I think of as what was natural. Talk a little bit about the evolution and impacts of fishing, technology, and practices today. Talk about some coastal ecosystem dynamics, which I think are very relevant, and the climate challenges and opportunities we have now and for tomorrow. Of course, this is our backyard, right? The North Atlantic. It's really the world's youngest ocean, and it, as a cold water system, it's very young. And the biota that came into the North Atlantic came in from the North Pacific, but it was an incomplete inoculation. So, the core of codfish. There's more species of cod in the North Pacific than there are in the North Atlantic. We happen to have the largest, but in any case. Then we actually had these pesky glaciers. Every 120,000 years, they would roar down and create a significant extinctions in the western North Atlantic. And this leaves us with remarkably low species diversity. For this kind of an ecosystem, the lowest diversity of any place on the planet. And yet, it's extremely productive. And so you have a lot of productivity channeling through relatively few nodes. And that tends towards booms and busts, and I think that has been our bigger history. So, if we think about the pristine state of Maine, and I turn to archaeological information. This is from the mouth of Penobscot Bay, North Haven Island, and Turner Farm. One of the best studied archaeological sites on the coast of Maine. And in that, in the Indian Middens, we basically are dumpster diving, going back 4,000 years, 5,000 years. And in those middens, we find fish hooks that are carved out of deer bones, and that's a cod vertebra with a centimeter scale behind it. So that's a huge cod. We know those cow cod are out there. As a matter of fact, the average size over about a 4,000-year period, reconstructed from the vertebral diameters, was about 1 meter in length, average size. And the most recent trawl data is about half that size throughout the region. So they were big, they were abundant. And when we look through the midden fragments, we find codfish bones dominating the system. And number 2 are flounder and sea mink, which went extinct in the 1800s. But they were also getting swordfish, sturgeon. But we learned a couple things. The earliest people on the coast of Maine loved seafood. And what's also really interesting is that there are no lobsters or crabs in any of the middens in the North Atlantic. And it's not because, and middens are just the dump sites, it's not because they don't preserve, because there are lots of other places where they do preserve, in Oregon, in Alaska. And I think it's because they were actually relatively rare in a pristine state. By the time we fast forward to some of the first explorers on the coast of Maine, in the 1600s they were describing cod and haddock everywhere. And so we know that we had a system that was dominated by large predatory fish, ground fish, cod in particular. And the North Atlantic, I think, was entirely dominated that way. There's very similar stories to be told up in Scandinavia, Europe, and the UK. And that's different from the North Pacific, which is a marine mammal dominating system. And I could get into some of those interesting details. We actually published a paper on that. But with the peopling of the state of Maine, and we actually had the first export to the New World, which were codfish. You can take Penobscot Bay, which is not very far from here, and you could sort of subdivide it in a couple of different segments, from the river to the lower bay. And then the historical record is actually not bad, starting in the 1800s. And this is illustrating just a simple point, and that is early on, all landings were very high and peaked up the river. And they used a lot of weirs and other methods, and then it declined and collapsed. The estuary was a little bit later, upper bay a little bit later, and then you get to the lower bay in the 1860s and then beyond. And so what you're seeing is actually what we would call a sort of a serial extirpation, and I think that actually has continued. But that lower bay bump, in fact, is also part of the larger fleet moving from the coast of Maine to places like Browns Bank and George's Bank, and very large landings going on in the 1850s. So you guys, everybody knows this. But, you know, so we went from sailing vessels to steam, developed better technology, things like purse seine. Importantly, we had refrigeration, and we had transportation that allowed the product to get out in far and wide. So our technology started outstripping the capacity of local resources to maintain themselves. And if you just look again at Penobscot Bay as someplace where we've assembled some of this information from the 1800s, and what you end up seeing, in fact, is an increase as fishing gear improved in terms of landings, just in terms of pounds. When you had this technological improvement in the 1930s, we start seeing these local landings declining, and then you see really the offshore fisheries developing in a big way with herring, lobster, and redfish. And so, you know, what I didn't realize when I first came is that I'm dealing with a coastline that has 5,000 years of fishing, and I thought I was studying a pristine state. But I think if you put it together, you might make the case that, you know, we had a trophic cascade with large apex predators throughout the North Atlantic, cod being maybe the most important, but not the only one by any means. And those abundant carnivores kept a lot of the prey, I think, in check. By and large, all the ecosystems of the world that have abundant fish predators do not have mobile benthic invertebrates. And so sea urchins and lobsters and crabs were probably relatively suppressed. I think the reason why we don't see lobsters and crabs in the ancient Indian middens has to do with being held in check by the big coastal predators that we had at the time. Because of our very low diversity, we really only have one herbivore in this coastal system. It's the sea urchin. And if the sea urchin was suppressed, we probably... Well, I think everybody here knows the story of the cod. If you take all the NIMS trawl data since 1968, you get a very interesting pattern. But if you look at it in terms of aggregate by decades, you'll see in the 1970s you had a very significant abundance of cod throughout the entire relatively shallow zones of Browns Bank, George's Bank, and the coast of Maine, and the Gulf of Maine, I should say. By the 1980s, we see this breaking up. This continues. Everybody here knows this story pretty well. But the point that I wanted to raise is that the coast of Maine now is largely predator-free. And this is the beginning of what some people describe as a domestication of this ecosystem. When you domesticate any ecosystem, take the predators out, whether you have to hunt the wolves or what have you, and then the cash crop can flourish. And one could see that sort of happen. What we call this is trophic level dysfunction. I like that term because it sounds scientific and I can get proposals funded. But it really refers to, you know, these predators are not gone. They're just, they're no longer at the abundance where they're really functioning as a major force. And because of that, prey species have exploded. And the sea urchin, of course, became incredibly abundant. It drove down the seaweed, and we had these sea urchin barrens. And other species, I think, have also profited from this. And I'll talk more in a bit about the lobster and crab story. But the sea urchins were interesting because we had a coastal system that was dominated by sea urchins. And it was really remarkable. In some places, you had carpets like this of sea urchins. Now, this is a potential resource, and it did not go unnoticed. In 1987, the sea urchin fishery began in Maine. It became second only to lobsters in terms of its value. It was remarkable, 1,500 full-time sea urchin fishermen. And unfortunately, this became a boom and a bust. And so, you know, to a degree, I think this may have been a perturbation of the system that created a tipping point. And so if you look at this from the 1960s to more or less today, you had the sea urchin fishery with landings that looked like this. I was actually quantifying sea urchin abundance, and sea urchin abundance crashed coincident with that, and this was all done in Pemaquid area, and I also saw the biomass decline. Simultaneously with that, because this is the only herbivore in this system, we saw this explosion of seaweed, which we call a phase shift. And so this happened very rapidly. This is some footage that I took in 1993 from my standard mooring at Pemaquid Point. And just exactly 2 years later, from exactly the same mooring, this is what it looked like. Remarkable change, just unlike anything you typically see on land. So what we're looking at now is the potential for having really trophic level dysfunction occurring at 2 levels. And you know, I think we can make a clear case that urchin fishing drove down the stocks, but it became a big question. Well, why didn't they come back? For all practical purposes, in lots of the coast of Maine, we are not fishing sea urchins, so they should recover. And this is just like every fisheries management plan in the past. You know, if we saw stocks go down, fishing mortality rates were too high, you just stop fishing and they should bounce back. And we thought that for lots of things, including cod. But in any case, what I just showed you is for Pemaquid Point, but I wanted to to determine if this was really the result of fishing. And so we actually have 2 zones in the state of Maine. They're very creatively named Zone 1, Zone 2. And if you look at the landings, you find that where people were most abundant and the fishery began in Zone 1, it peaked first and collapsed first, and Zone 2 peaked second and collapsed second. So you actually have a trend. And then when you look at research sites that I did along this area, I looked at sea urchin abundance and showed it declined, coincident with the fishery that began there. And then the algal cover, it increased. That happened in 1994. Pemaquid was a little bit stranger, but came in a little bit later, but it's completely flipped, has not flipped back to around 2000, 2002. Mount Desert flipped a little bit later. And Jonesport just flipped a long time ago. But in any case, the phase shift was very widespread. And the question becomes why they didn't recover. And without boring you with a lot of details, because we did a ton of work on this, and I had PhD students working on this, is basically, we now have this shag carpet as a perfect cover for little crabs. And crabs that reproduce and they settle indiscriminately, they get eaten if they fall in the wrong place. So this is a shag carpet, which is a nursery habitat for predatory crabs. I was telling this story one time in a BBC interview, and I talked about the shag carpets. You have to be mindful for your audience, I think. But you know, what happens to small crustaceans on barren substrates if everything is grazed down? And this is stuff that I did with Rick Wally years ago. But those little dots on this patio block, that's a little lobster at the settlement stage. And there is more than 1 per meter square small predatory fish that are not necessarily commercially at risk. And there's a sea of mouths down there. They happen to be small mouths, and that's a problem for settling lobsters and for settling crabs. And so when I first started working in 1975 on the coast of Maine, it was mostly this kind of a barren, and that, in fact, is a settling sea urchin. Now, sea urchins have almost no food value. They're ignored by fish, and the sea urchin did just great. Then we had this phase shift, and these pictures, by the way, were all taken within about the same couple of years. What we ended up with is a world that was hostile to settling crabs because of the little fish that would eat them, but really good for settling sea urchins because nobody wanted to eat those little spiny suckers. And then when we had this phase shift, suddenly we had a cover for crabs. So it was good for settling crabs. These baby crabs love to eat sea urchins, and so it became hostile for settling sea urchins. So the phase shift increased the nursery habitat for crabs. We were getting 200 baby crabs per meter square. And granted, that was a kind of a record, but nevertheless, those micropredators are really important. And I've been following that, and there's still a lot of crabs in this system. The question is, was this demographically important? Is this just a small thing that's going on locally and it doesn't have any bigger significance? I think it does have bigger significance. If you look at the NIMS trawl data for Cancer borealis, the Jonah crab, going back to 1975, you see a relatively low number showing up in the inshore trawls, not the inshore, but the trawl surveys. Then we had this phase shift in 1995, and we've had significantly more Jonah crabs, and that sort of is coincident with this algal shift. Now, this is some video footage that I took a couple of years ago, and there's a crab, and this is out by Idaho. There's a crab, and there's 3 crabs in that shot. No cover at all. These guys are just out. There's a crab, this is amazing. There's another crab there. There's a lobster over there on the left. I mean, they're just like sitting out on a parking lot, and they really don't care about anything. That was a 23-second video clip with 9 Jonah crabs and 1 lobster. We've got a huge number out there, and it has not gone unnoticed, as you all know. Jonah crabs is now booming in value. So what I'm getting at is that these ecological interactions that are happening in one place can have much bigger effects elsewhere, including important fisheries management issues. So we decided we would play God, and we would try to break this phase shift. So we went around Maine, and we found adult urchins. We transplanted them to these little offshore islands that were surrounded by sand that would hold them. And so we had 3,000 sea urchins per plot, 8 to 9 release sites. We repeated that twice. We moved 51,000 sea urchins, and that's when I realized that those little micro predators actually do grow up, and they become macro predators, and they have an attitude. And so we had 3,000 sea urchins per plot for a couple of months, and then we monitored the crabs, and the crabs came up. We watched them eat these sea urchins, and when all the urchins were gone, the crabs left. So we actually have a new apex predator, and he moves it, and this is a real problem in the sense of having sea urchins come back. So if you just were starting off and you'd look at this system, you'd say, wow, that's a pristine system. No sea urchins, we've got lobsters and crabs, they're very abundant, we've got all this kelp around. All I'm suggesting is this is anything but pristine. But nevertheless, there's been a real plus consequence, and that has to do with this guy. Now, back in the turn of the last century, Herrick was thinking about lobsters and wrote, next to man and his traps, codfish is probably the most destructive enemy of the lobster. That was a time when coastal codfish and coastal lobsters coexisted. That has not happened in our lifetime, but in any case, that's really interesting. And I was able to get out to Cassius Ledge back in the 80s, where there were really large populations of predatory finfish. And those are mostly pollock that you're seeing there, of course, but on those patio blocks, we have lobsters tethered and video cameras running as much as we possibly could. There were wolffish, cod, cunner, and they were all right around us while we were diving, which is something that is not common on the coast of Maine today. But this kelp forest was a terrific opportunity to look at what it was like in the past. And we found that about 75% of all the lobsters that we tethered were eaten within 24 hours. And as a matter of fact, we lost 5 of those patio blocks. So I think it's fair to say that we're talking about an ecosystem that's fundamentally changed in favor of the lobster. And it's not just this predator story, of course, but let's put this into economic terms. I happen to be doing some work with a group on what is the value of all marine resources in the 1880s, and it turned out to be $19.3 million in the 1880s. More recent data shows that when we correct for inflation, it's $323 million. And so it's actually worth more, corrected for inflation, than it was in the 1800s. But look at the diversity that was harvested. In the 1880s, the #1 most valuable species was mackerel. This is what we're looking at today. And so whereas 24% of the entire value was from lobsters in the past, it's now 92% in Penobscot Bay. And it's in the 80th percentile for the state of Maine. So people could think, well, you know, lobsters are valuable, so this is a success story. But if we consider the larger socioeconomic impact, this is the gilded trap that Pat was referring to, whether it's masking a bigger problem. And while technology has really improved for lobstering, really the stocks have not declined. Even catch per unit of effort shows that they're outpacing our capacity to fish. I mean, this has not gone unnoticed. A New York Times front page article about lobster stocks booming in 2001, and you probably all know about the crisis of 2012 when we just simply had more product than we could deal with, and the price per pound dropped. If you look at this in terms of Maine's lobster landings and value, you probably all know that we exceeded $500 million last year, and that's pretty amazing. But it's a good idea to be so dependent on just really one species. And really the dependence is more than on just on one species. You know, if you think about this relative to herring, when I got started, it was very clear the biggest tonnage that was landed in the state of Maine was herring. And if you look at the herring landings in metric tons starting in 1950, and you compare that to lobsters, what you see is really shocking, and that is the tonnage of lobsters that are harvested today exceeds the tonnage of herring. And when you consider how many, you know, the bait to product ratio, we are now importing bait from as far away as New Zealand. But this also shows another problem, and that is the value of herring, dollars per metric ton, has gone way up. So we're spending a lot more to maintain this lucrative monoculture. And this increased dependency on bait is actually another problem, that it's kind of increasing our dependence on really two species now. So that's bait for the gilded trap. And one could argue that this is a domesticated ecosystem, one in which we've actually removed the predators, but now we're feeding them with bait from other sources, not just the state of Maine. And there's been isotope work documenting that most of lobster nutrition in areas that are heavily fished is coming from lobster trap bait. Well, okay, what about our changing climate? You know, since we're talking about lobsters, we're in Maine, the larvae of lobsters is key to their abundance. And what's really interesting is that there's been a ton of studies done in the United States and in Canada showing that there's basically a thermal threshold where it's too cold for baby lobsters. They'll dive down and then they hit cold water, and I'd be the same way, go back up to the warm water. And then there's a temperature that's just right for settlement, but then there's temperatures that are too warm. And so on the coast of Maine, if you use those temperatures and you just look at values that we get from satellites and from shoreline sensors, we see areas that were too cold and areas that are a bit too warm. So really, we're talking about having a sweet spot, a thermal sweet spot right in Maine. So a lot of this abundance may have to do with our luck relative to climate change. But we also know that the climate is changing, and there's a paper published in Science, but it looks at where do we expect to see the biggest anomaly, the biggest warming. Our region is one of the areas we're expecting to see that. And if you look at DMR's Booth Bay sea temperature record going back to 1906 or 1905, you see a pattern of clear and significant warming, much greater than the rest of the world's oceans. Now, if there's a thermal threshold, and when we had colder temperatures, it was relatively shallow, where they'd hit 12 degrees and go back up. So the settlement area was small. But as water temperature warms, this settlement area kind of expands. And so we're actually increasing the nursery habitat. Now, if you look at Maine's inshore trawl surveys, they go from Region 1 to Region 4, and that's from west to east. And when we look at temperature, and by the way, I'm working on this in a much more sophisticated way, but this will show it reasonably well. This is just going from the year 2000 and looking at temperature in all five of those regions. And if you buy the thermal threshold, and I think there's pretty good evidence for it, and then you just simply draw this line, what you see is region 1 by 2000 was already over that. Region 2 hit it a little bit later, region 3, region 4, region 5. And basically, if you then look at lobster landings per length of coastline, this way I can take each county and make them similar. So for every kilometer of coast, how many kilograms is harvested? What you'll see for York and Cumberland, that's our southern region, you see that they're pretty low, around 2,000. And then you see them increasing, and I think this is in keeping with that increase in temperature. And that increase began 1975, 1980. If we do this for a little bit farther north, we see that this shift happened in the early 1990s, and then it goes on, and we see two things. The shift is happening a little bit later, and the maximum amount is even higher when standardized for coastlines. So what we're looking at here is a pattern, I think, of a moving sweet spot. And we've seen this increasing along the coast of Maine, and if we bring this back to this, it's possible that we are seeing warming that's going to cause this sweet spot to move. And one could argue that there may be a time when we're going to be seeing a whole lot less in the way of the conditions that are perfect for lobsters. As those of you from further south know, warming has gone on there as well. Scott Nixon put together a long data set. And now if you start talking about, rather than the warm temperatures that lobsters want, but what about the high temperatures that are harmful for lobsters? They start getting stressed at about 18 degrees, but at 20 degrees it's really a serious issue for them. And what this paper suggests down for Woods Hole area is that we are consistently above a very stressful 20 degrees in Woods Hole area. So is southern New England getting too warm for lobsters? You know, the problem is obviously there in that we have lobster traps. You know, the state of Maine, you know, welcome to Maine. We've got 1.2 million people, and we've got 3.5 million traps. And so 6,000 lobstermen depend on this one species, and I worry about it being basically a socioeconomic time bomb. If we go to Long Island Sound, things were looking great. The temperatures were good, and lobsters were increasing, and the management was doing everything that they could. And then we had 1998, which was the warmest year on the planet at the time, and shell disease that had been just a problem for big lobsters became epizootic, and lobster stocks crashed about 80%. This actually, it shows the other side of this business. It surprised people, and these warming seas are a serious problem, not just for lobsters. Ken Drinkwater up in Canada basically said in 2005 that we can anticipate temperature changes on the order of 2 to 4 degrees warmer in Georges Bank in the Gulf of Maine. When you do that, and he asserted that in fact those temperatures are going to be getting too warm. When you look at the red dots, that would be where you're going to expect decreases in cod, and then you have areas that are yellow and green, which mean no change or increasing. And with 1 degree, you have a line that runs like that. With 2 degrees, it runs like this. And if you get to the highest point that they're talking about for the Gulf of Maine, it suggests that cod, the environment will be just hostile for cod. Not everybody believes this, but it is certainly a concern. And the other point, though, with this warming temperature, I don't think there's any doubt that we're seeing this warming. But the interesting thing is that there's evidence from a number of species that we're seeing stocks moving northward. Red hake is a great example. And that's something that was absolutely rare in the 1960s in the Gulf of Maine, and not at all now, and it matches very well this warming pattern. Many of you also know about this story with the black sea bass. I first heard about the black sea bass from lobstermen I know and going out with it. They were talking about black sea bass a long time before DMR was, no offense. And that was really fascinating to me. I mean, that's a really good value fish. And you probably know, if you look at the overall abundance of black sea bass, and it's a mid-Atlantic species, you know, found in southern New England, but now being found in greater numbers in the Gulf of Maine. And undoubtedly, there are more species coming. Now, the good news is that if we're talking about diversity, but, you know, diversity of species increases economic diversity, and it could start reducing some of this pressure on lobsters. And just talking to Trish Cheney just a moment ago, some of the real advances, for example, with scallops, how they're managed and how they're marketed, how you can add value, I think is probably the best thing that we could be focused on to try to minimize possible economic declines that are related to climate shifts and reductions in lobster landings. The ocean heat wave in 2012, many people know about it. It's actually part of this really rapid increase in temperature recently. And again, the fishermen were the first to know about it. They called me up and they said, lobsters are shedding and it's April. What's going on? So I called the leading physical oceanographer in the state of Maine, and she had no idea that there was a thermal anomaly at that point. Fishermen were also the first to adapt to the changes. It was so interesting to me to see exactly where people were fishing that summer. I mean, instantly, entirely different fishing patterns, normally fishing shoal water in July. And I think that there's a lesson here, and that is, I think we have to sort of think about reinventing fisheries management so fishermen can become better stewards and of their fishing grounds. I'd like to see much more involvement in local assessments. I think the kinds of changes I'm talking about are happening in local areas, not overall. The people who are most at risk are the stakeholders, and if we could come up with ways of assessing and regulating our fisheries in a much more localized way than we're currently doing, I think it's going to help us as we go into all of these surprises that relate to climate change. Here in Maine, we actually have a coast and a maritime heritage that is very dependent on fishing. The darker things, colors there, I'm colorblind, but I can see dark. And those are the commercial fishing dependents along the coast of Maine. And so for all this, I'd like to have a couple of conclusions. I think Maine's maritime heritage depends on the sustainability of its marine resources. I'd hate to see just simple gentrification of the coast and it turns into a theme park. Natural resources are rapidly changing in dynamic ways. I hope I've illustrated that. And these changes are first observed by local fishing communities, and I hope we can tap into some of that knowledge. And the challenge will be find ways of locally managing these dynamic ecosystems sustainably. So I barely covered the tip of the iceberg, right? A tiny bit of a very complex system. I touched on ocean warming, but not other difficult and important problems that relate to pollution, sea level rise, ocean acidification, invasive species. Hell, a whole thing on invasive species. Land use practices. Several of these, I think, could be good points for discussions. And with that, I thank you all.